Welcome, everyone. I'm Maureen O'Connor, president of Palo Alto University. Palo Alto University is dedicated to addressing pressing and emerging issues through research and training in the fields of psychology and counseling. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar series, At the Forefront of Mental Health. Today's discussion focuses on substance use and what parents can do to keep their children safe. We have an exemplary panel that will be introduced in a moment. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator of this wonderful panel, Dr. Erica Cameron, Provost and Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs at Palo Alto University. Dr. Cameron's career in education includes 4 years teaching and counseling students in juvenile detention, 6 years as a K-12 school counselor, 13 years in higher education. She was the 2020 recipient of the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision's Counseling Vision and Innovation Award. And she earned her PhD in counselor education from the University of Missouri in St. Louis and has a master's in guidance and counseling from the University of Hawaii. We are absolutely thrilled that she is the provost of our institution, and I offer her to you now as your moderator for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President O'Connor, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to moderate this webinar. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to start with a few statistics that shed some light on why youth substance abuse is a national public health concern. According to the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, at least 1 in 8 teenagers has abused an illicit substance in the last year. For teenagers between the ages of 15 and 19, the opioid death rate increased more than fourfold from 2018 to 2021. And in 2021, California experienced 6,843 opioid-related overdose deaths. According to the California Department of Public Health, 224 of those were fentanyl-related overdose deaths that occurred among teens between the ages of 15 and 19. The statistics are concerning. And as a parent of a college student and 2 elementary school students, we play an essential role as parents and guardians in the health and safety of our children. Today's extremely hazardous substance landscape presents new challenges to keep our youth safe, especially as they become independent in high school, college, and the working world. Today, I am joined by an expert panel for a discussion about the hazards that substance use presents and practical approaches for parents and guardians to prevent and safeguard their children from the harms that substance use causes. They will conclude by offering practical tips on how to talk about prevention and harm reduction with youth and adolescents. Please help me in welcoming Kevin Buchanan, principal of Los Gatos High School, and from Palo Alto University, Dr. Nancy Haug, Dr. Amy Haas, and Dr. Wendy Wade. Would each of you please take a moment to tell us a little bit about your background? Kevin, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Dr. Cameron. My name is Kevin Buchanan. I am the principal of Los Gatos High School in Los Gatos, California. I've been a high school administrator for 20 years. This is my 20th year. I began as a teacher in the inner city of Los Angeles. So I've kind of seen both ends of the spectrum in terms of socioeconomics and demographics and achievement. That's probably it. Yeah, I've been here I'm in my 2nd year here at Los Gatos. I was formerly an English teacher, originally from England.
Thank you, Kevin. Dr. Haas, do you mind providing an intro?
I'm Amy Haas. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I also have graduate minors in pharmacology and research quantitative methods from the University of South Florida. I worked at UC San Francisco doing a postdoctoral fellowship in addictions research as well, before launching into academia with an interesting intersection that I worked in academia, but I also worked as a consultant for one of the universities around here in their Office of Student Life. And my particular area of expertise is underage and particularly college student alcohol use and misuse, and now I've merged into substance use and misuse. So I've been having a programmatic line of research over the past 2 decades, looking at what are kids doing? What are the kind of practices that they're doing? What are the consequences that they're having? What are the existing interventions and do they work? So hopefully what I'll be able to bring to the table is a landscape of what the situation looks like. What are we looking at now, or what could be looking at in the future, and how might parents want to look at that lens moving forward?
Thank you for being here, Dr. Haas. Next, Dr. Hogg.
Welcome, everyone. I am a clinical psychologist and professor at Palo Alto University, primarily based in the PGSP Stanford PsyD Consortium, where I teach, advise, and supervise students who are studying to become psychotherapists. I teach a course in treatment for substance use disorders, and my background is in evidence-based practices for addiction treatment. I lead the harm reduction and addiction treatment laboratory at PAU, and I also have a clinical faculty appointment at the Stanford School of Medicine Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, where I'm closely affiliated with the Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Program, where I do some teaching and training as well. And finally, I have a small private practice where I see patients who are struggling with addictive disorders and other mental health conditions. And I'm also the parent of a 15-year-old high school freshman and a 12-year-old middle schooler.
Thank you, Dr. Hogg. Dr. Wade, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm a assistant professor in the Master's in Counseling program. I primarily teach the addiction counseling course, but I teach other courses as well. That's my main interest. I've been working with primarily my interest is young children whose parents have alcoholism or addiction, and seeing to it that the children get help so they know what's going on in their family, they understand what's going on, and giving them some tools for prevention. And so that's where I focused. I began when the field began in 1980, and I've worked in it off and on ever since then as an advocate for the children.
Thank you all for being here. Kevin, I'm going to first start with you. As a high school principal, please share what you're experiencing on the front lines with high school students.
You know, I remember when I was in school, it was all about cigarette smoking. We would go behind the bike sheds, and I remember our administrators would look for cigarette butts and matches and a way to try to figure out what the kids were up to. Well, things have changed a lot from then. Our kids now are very educated, very sophisticated. What they're doing is pretty advanced. It's kind of hard for us to keep up. We went from cigarettes to marijuana, and marijuana was usually they were smoking joints, and that was how they were ingesting it. Now it's edibles, it's vape cartridges, very sophisticated vape. I remember when they first got the vape devices, they would actually plug them into their computers in class, and the teachers thought they were flash drives. So vaping is still a thing. It's gone from vaping nicotine to vaping marijuana. Most of the vapes we catch now are marijuana. They're using marijuana oil. They're using shatter. They're using all kinds of marijuana products that are available freely in dispensaries. They have 18-year-old friends who can easily get this stuff. It's not access is just not an issue. It's very easy for them to get it. And when you talk to the kids about this stuff, they think it's safe. They think the vape is somehow safe. It's not harmful. They know by smoking it with a joint, they believe, well, that's harmful. That's putting smoke in your lungs. But for some reason, they're buying the R.J. Reynolds line that vaping is somehow safer. And then more recently, in the last few years, we've started to see a lot of pharmaceutical use. It started off where they would visit their grandparents and they would raid the medicine cabinets and raid their grandparents or their parents' pills. Parents were not counting their pills. Now they were grandparents. Now they're getting them off the street, and they're being marketed to the students in, again, very sophisticated ways, using technologies that we don't usually use. We don't usually get on Discord. We usually are not on, adults are not on Snapchat. I'm afraid most of us still on Facebook, and the kids are not on Facebook anymore. And they're buying what they think is Adderall or Percocet or Oxycontin. And what they're doing is they're not even eating the pills. They're smoking the pills, and they believe that somehow they know about fentanyl. We've talked to them, we've explained to them, we've done a lot of publicity on it. So now they think they can regulate their dosage. They think if they take the whole pill, it'll kill them. But if they can smoke it, they can hit it a couple of times and then go back to class. And then later on, they still have a little bit left on the tinfoil. And they're not buying fentanyl. They're buying what they think is Oxy or Adderall or Percocet or something else. And now what we're seeing is disco flavors, whereas it's been marketed them as a party drug similar to MDMA or ecstasy. It's multicolored. It comes in Rice Krispie flavors. I remember we used to tell parents, smell your kids' laundry. If their clothes smell like Skittles, they're probably vaping. Well, that's kind of what's happening now. They're selling them fruit flavors, and that's kind of what we're seeing. And smoked on little pieces of foil with a rolled up dollar bill, very kind of very basic.
Thank you, Kevin. Some of what we hear may be jarring, and I'm sure it's raising some red flags for folks in the audience. Amy, could you talk to us to give us maybe another perspective of in the developmental age period of what are you seeing as some of the things that are going on for college students? Absolutely.
And, I think Kevin's comments earlier kind of resonate an overall theme that I see, which is, I also am a parent of a high school senior and an 8th grader. And so for me, as I'm thinking about how do I keep my research going, I also think, how do I keep my children safe? And I think one thing it's important for us as parents is to be aware of the fact that the landscape is very different than when we were in high school or we were in college. One of the things seems to remain the same, though, and that's that college is a period where a lot of people view this as experimentation, as a time to test their limits, as a time to be free, because you're going to have to grow up when you're done. And so that carries forth, but I think the landscape looks quite a bit different. So just as some examples, alcohol used to be the big player. So back in the 1990s, early 2000s, about 90% of college students drank alcohol, but it's closer now to about 75 to 80%. But what's really interesting is the kids that are using in college, those that are getting drunk, those numbers have not radically gone down. They have gone down somewhat, but what we're seeing is less kids are trying it, but many people are still continuing to use heavily. But now the issue is not just alcohol. Cannabis has become much more accessible. It's become much more perceived as socially safe. So as Kevin was mentioning earlier, a lot of college students now view cannabis as safer than alcohol, which the optics don't necessarily go along with the data. We don't know if it's safer than than alcohol. We do know, too, that crossfading, so people who use alcohol and cannabis simultaneously, it's kind of like a new drug. It's not really alcohol. It's not really cannabis, but the consequences are different. So just from my own lab, for example, we know that kids who crossfade are more likely to black out, significantly different, from 25% in the past 3 months from just alcohol to 80% when they crossfade in the past 3 months. So as a changing landscape, we have to be kind of aware that it's happening. It's just happening differently than when we were younger. The hard drugs are still there. So we still see methamphetamines. We still see cocaine. We still see opiates. But as Kevin was saying, fentanyl is a big player now. And that's something to be mindful for, because a lot of college students may not understand that they're getting fentanyl as well, but they may also think they're getting fentanyl, but not understand that it's a much more potent drug than if they're getting Oxycontin or even heroin. So these are things to be mindful for. I just looked at some national statistics, and less than 1% of kids use heroin, but they have a much greater likelihood of potentially using other drugs that they're not even aware of in the context of farming parties, where they go into a party and everyone contributes something and they're not quite sure what they're getting. There's still the same pressure. I just want to point forth that the landscape of drugs is changing, but the same reasons why people use substances in college remain the same. And I think we just need to be on the cusp of, as parents, of understanding that how do we balance, if they're going to experiment, how do they do it safely? How do we suggest abstinence versus harm reduction as a better goal for them? And if you have kids that maybe you're thinking of, like, my child may not have a trajectory of college, well, there's good news and bad news with their drug use potential. So there's national data that shows that kids who don't go on to college actually use more in high school, but it drops off more when they're older. But that doesn't mean that they're not still using. That doesn't mean the trajectories aren't still there. It just means that a lot of the data you might be hearing about college kids may not be fully resonant with your kids. I think that's kind of the landscape, just to point and round things out.
Thank you, Amy. Wendy, let's rewind in time a little bit. Let's look at, your work has involved addiction and with its effects on families. How early are you seeing addiction issues actually arise?
Well, nearly all people who develop addiction start their use of alcohol and drugs, their troubled use of that, when they're about 12 to 14. Now, there are many, many reports of children who begin as early as 9 or 10, and some even before that. We really want to have our prevention sorts of information to come well before we typically start it. When children are developing addiction, ones who will develop addiction, they tend to start using earlier than other children. They also show a higher tolerance right away. So they'll drink 4 beers and not show much effect, where another person may drink 4 beers and be stumbling, not be able to talk. And so that high tolerance, even though the blood alcohol is the same, seems like a good thing. And people kind of reward kids who can drink more than other kids. It's a popular thing. But addiction progresses much faster when children use when they're teenagers. So one of the things that parents ask about often is if there are genetics in the family, if there's someone in the family with addiction, is my child going to become addicted? And genetics genetic predisposition is definitely involved when addiction develops, but it only counts for about 50%. And the environment is really what we want to look at. And that's something that we can start helping parents with when their children are very young. Environment problems that wake up, so to speak, the genes include many different kinds of things. Chronic unmanaged stress in the family is really one of the main precursors, I would say. If there's a lot of family discord, a lot of fighting and arguing, domestic violence, certainly, if one or more parent has addiction or alcoholism themselves, that can set up an environment that's very chaotic or lead to neglect and abuse as well. So we really want to help our families, be cohesive and be able to and have our parents be able to parent the way they want to with the support that they need. Other environmental concerns are children in foster care sometimes, but there are bigger environmental issues as well. That there's racism definitely can contribute, poverty, absolutely, gender bullying and all other kinds of bullying, which is pretty rampant, especially in middle school. And so a child who just doesn't feel like they belong may very well want to fit in that way. So we know that nearly everyone who develops addiction has experienced some sort of trauma or this kind of chronic stress.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a really good segue. Nancy, I think it's important that we talk about what seems to be motivators for why we're seeing a rise in adolescent substance use. Could you talk to that and also maybe some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I can talk about what I see in my practice. I see mostly adults, but I also see some young adults, college students, and maybe some older teens. And I see a lot of alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis, particularly the vaping among young people has escalated over the past 5 to 10 years. I also see misuse of prescription drugs. So opioid pain pills like OxyContin, Percodan, hydrocodone, sedatives like benzodiazepines, Valium, Xanax, and then particularly stimulants, which are often prescribed for ADHD, such as Ritalin and Adderall. And often the teens will misuse some of the prescription drugs that may or may not have been prescribed to them. So sometimes they do have a condition and they will take more of the Adderall than they were prescribed, or maybe it was prescribed to a family member or a friend and they're using it. I had one girl who was taking her friend's Adderall to stay up late and study and do homework and write papers. And there was this perception that it just wasn't harmful or dangerous. And maybe for some kids, they can drink and use cannabis and it's fine and they don't go on to have problems with it. But we know from the research that early initiation of alcohol and substance use is associated with increased risk later in life. In other words, most of the adults who struggle with addiction and substance use disorders, really problematic substance use, they started using as a teen, like Wendy said. And because their brains aren't fully developed and they may be more sensitive to the reinforcing effects of these drugs, the teenagers are more prone to develop a substance use disorder and to develop it more quickly than adults, especially if they have these other risk factors. In the high school and college environment, there's a lot of opportunities, right, for exposure to drugs. And kids use drugs for a lot of different reasons. Some of it's experimentation, wanting to fit in with their peers. There might be some peer pressure, autonomy from their parents, forming their identity. For others, it might be dealing with stress, the stress of college application, figuring out their future job plans if they don't intend to go to college. I also see a lot of boredom and loneliness as contributing to substance use problems, especially when there's other mental health conditions on board, like anxiety, depression, ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Substance use for these youth can be a form of psychological coping with distress and emotional pain. This is often termed self-medication. So substance use as a form of avoidance or escape from uncomfortable emotions. And I think that can also, lead to more serious substance use problems when there's all of these different things on board. And I can give an example. I recently saw a 20-year-old who had a long-standing ADHD diagnosis who came into treatment to deal with a lot of anxiety about his future and conflict with his parents. He was really having a lot of trouble getting along with his parents. And when I did a further assessment, I found out that he was misusing his prescription Adderall. He was drinking energy drinks with a high amount of caffeine, and he was vaping both nicotine and cannabis at very high levels, like constantly. So before he even got out of bed, he was picking up his vape and vaping. And he really didn't see the caffeine or the vaping as a problem. And he was having heart palpitations and panic attacks. And it was likely related to all of the stimulants he was using. And so, we really had to kind of unpack all of the substance use and the role that the substance use was playing in his anxiety and in the conflict with his parents. I had another teen who was in her senior year of high school, highly competitive, A student, very stressed about getting into some top colleges. And she started using prescription pain pills so she could sleep at night, exactly like Kevin was saying, went through, a medicine cabinet. And then when those ran out, she started ordering them online, which we know is pretty dangerous. And the escalation was pretty rapid and kind of unexpected, given the student's academic profile. And no one had any idea what was going on with her. Like, it just didn't seem to really make any sense. I just want to highlight one other thing, is that, like everyone has said, the landscape has changed. Like, it's really different than when we grew up. And one of the things that I think is really key here is the role of technology and social media. Social media intersects with substance use. It can cause isolation, it can cause loneliness, cyberbullying, unhealthy social comparisons, and it can lead to mental health problems, increasing the odds that kids will turn to substances. And it also provides access to the substances. So I think that this is a variable in the equation that we can't ignore.
I may be dating myself and showing how young I am. But I don't ever remember my parents having a conversation about drugs. I remember a Saturday PSA with a frying pan and an egg, and it's saying, "This is your brain on drugs." Wendy, there's a question in the Q&A. What age do you begin talking about drug use?
Some of the things that a parent can do before actually talking about drugs or alcohol is to have some input in the child learning how to have fun in many different ways. And so they don't think the only way I can have fun is drugs or alcohol. We want to start talking to them in elementary school for sure. The DARE program, I think that many people, I think you might have experienced that, my sons did also, was really something that has kind of scared people into not using drugs, only it wasn't as effective as they wanted to. But really, they're how to teach kids refusal skills, which is the best part of DARE. But I think just if there's drug and alcohol in the family, you might want to talk about it earlier and explain that briefly, but don't over stress. That's one thing that some parents will do. They'll talk about it where their kids going, oh, what is this stuff that they're so interested in? And so we're going to just start just mentioning it, pointing something out if there's a commercial on TV or something, just to give kids some prevention skills along the way and to give them some solid information.
Yeah, in my career as a school counselor, we often said that high school's too late at that point, that it's actually really great to start in your upper elementary age, so like 4th, 5th grade, to really start having real conversations.
Right.
Nancy, you have in your work, what should parents say, or what do they need to know?
I think building honest, meaningful relationships with their children, and maybe that involves disclosing about their own substance use, maybe it doesn't, but really being sort of open about the dangers of substance use. And each parent is going to have a different approach. I've worked with some parents who are very permissive, and they use alcohol and cannabis in front of their kids and allow them to sample it or to try it at home. And that is one approach. I think that parents need to be careful with that, especially if it's a form of avoidance of they just don't want to deal with it. So, I'm going to let them use it home because it's safer, because they're not driving and I can control it. But if they haven't had that conversation about what it looks like and what their approach is, it can be unhealthy if it's more like, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just going to let them do it at home. The opposite of that is sort of this more authoritarian, very hard line, like, never use. And, and I understand that approach as well, because I've seen it, but I think like Wendy was saying, that can tend to backfire and make kids more interested in trying it out and rebelling. So I think there has to be some sort of happy medium with the parenting. I think they call that authoritative, where you sort of balance like, the permissive aspects and the authoritarian. But it's really about building that trusting, honest, open relationship with your kid, not being too intrusive, but also not being uninvolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Nancy, you're totally right on this point, because developmentally, when we're looking at children's development, there has to be a solid foundation in that identity and the ability to experiment, but there has to be the safety net and also the boundaries of it. And I think that's what you're seeing with parents, is to allow that, not allow, but provide boundaries, but at least the open communication and trust is really what parents should be striving for, so that their child feels comfortable talking to them and expressing their needs. Amy, how do I'm going to put myself in this, and maybe some other parents or guardians could resonate. How do I know if I'm being effective if I'm having these conversations?
I think that's the kicker question, right? I think part of it is understanding your child from a couple of different perspectives. So I'm going to go back to something that Wendy said a few moments ago about like, when is the timing and what to do. We actually have a little science to guide us on it, that there's the thoughts about why they're using, but then there's also the beliefs about what are they going to get out of the substance if they use? What's their motivation? And so one of the things we know is that young kids, like elementary school kids in 2nd grade, if you ask them, is alcohol good or bad? They're not going to tell you it's good. They're going to tell you it's either neutral or it's bad. But there's a huge shift between third and fourth grade that now there's a maybe. And one of the thoughts about when you sort of, are you being effective? Do you talk with your children, is making sure you meet them where they are. If you come in and start alcohol education with a second grader and talk about it, well, they might think it's bad. They may very well just naturally start to get curious with it by fifth grade, kind of being on point with where you're at with it. But I think the effectiveness really has to do with what you want as a parent too. If you're really are adamant that you want your child to wait until they're older, there's reasons why it's beneficial. We know that putting alcohol and cannabis on a developing brain can change things. And there are some families that may be very abstinence focused for a variety of reasons. In that case, you're really going to be wanting to look at, well, if you're effective, if you're keeping your child from using. But for many people, and I think that resonates with the idea about why we're calling this practical parenting, is you have to understand where that decision point is for you. An effective target for some people may be, I want my child to understand what substances are and what's healthy substance use and not. And other people may say, I understand that in the context that my child may make a mistake and has learned from it. So part of it, I think, is really thinking, what is the relationship you want your child to have with substances? And then how do you create an environment that works within where they're at to make that happen? And there's no hard and fast answer to that. You know, I will speak that one of my other positions that I do too is I'm over at Stanford, and I've worked with their Office of Alcohol Policy and Education. And we did a study where we looked at college freshmen who had overdosed and wound up transporting to the hospital. And we looked at the study, not just from who they were, but what happened the night they were transported compared to other nights. And I think with the idea about how do you know you're being effective is that one of the things that we found was that most of the people that overdosed, they identified as female, they were younger, and they had no alcohol experience prior to coming to college. And so they had studied hard, they'd worked hard to get to an elite school, and they didn't have that knowledge. And so being effective, I think you could think, well, it's effective that my child didn't use, but then also we need to think about what may the relationship be moving forward. And that's a tough one that only your family can make that decision of. But I think you also want your children, if you think that they may have substances involved later, to be aware of the information and understanding when they're experimenting, when they may need to stop. And so those may be conversations about effectiveness you may want to think about having, if that's part of how your family system works and your cultural beliefs work.
Thank you, Amy. As we all know, it really takes a village to raise children these days. So Kevin, I'm wondering, as schools are partnering, in this, what is going on in schools?
So we're educators, so we use what we know best. We use education as the way to try and combat this. We have other resources. There are disciplinary resources. We have law enforcement. We have school resource officers, and but we mainly try to educate the students. And similar to what Amy was saying, we try to be practical. We try to respect our kids' intelligence and work on the notion that we're not going to preach. We're going to give you the facts. We're going to give you what we know. We're going to tell you about psychological addiction and psychological dependence, physiological dependence, the physiological impact of the various substances, and then move that into refusal skills and how do you and why do people use? What are the alternatives to using? What are some healthy ways to manage stress? What are some healthy ways to make friends? One of our recent dealers that we busted was he was giving it away. And why are you giving it away? And previously it was all very entrepreneurial. We would often catch dealers who weren't using. They weren't selling to support their habit. It was an entrepreneurial thing for them. But one of these guys was giving it away because he couldn't think of any other way to make friends. So this is how he could get an entree into certain peer groups by giving things away. We have classes. It's a mandatory 9th grade health class that every high school is required to teach, and the education is a part of that. We train our teachers. I remember when vapes first came out, we had to show our teachers what these devices look like. And more recently, we've done a big fentanyl awareness campaign where all of our teachers now have Narcan. I just put mine down. I had it right here. There's my little Narcan nasal spray. So we provided all our teachers with a Narcan nasal spray. We had a big parent evening. We brought in parents from students who had died of overdoses, who came back and helped us deliver these messages, very sad, impassioned messages. We work with outside groups one's called Song for Charlie, which is again a former parent of ours, to again be real with the kids and say, you will most likely have an opportunity to do this. These are some of the outcomes we've seen. This is what we're experiencing, and these are some of the other things you can do instead. And it's basically teaching the kids practical ways that they can still go to parties, still be social. We also talk about their social media profiles. Much like you said, much of this happens on social media, the way they connect with the dealers, the way they acquire the stuff on Snapchat. It's delivered like Grubhub or DoorDash. It's very easy for them to get it delivered to the campus. And then we explain to them what's in these substances and what the differences are between the pharmaceuticals and why the street drugs are so dangerous. So it's really education. That's really all we have to work with. And then obviously trying to bring our parents into that conversation, enable our teachers to spot the signs of students who may be in crisis, who may be at risk of engaging in some of these activities, and then also how to respond when they find out. And then again, working with our counseling department, make sure they're current, make sure they understand what's going on. It's really trying to, we're not trying to be friends with the kids, but we're trying to be real, we're trying to be practical. We realize that experimentation is part of the adolescent experience. But we explain the dangers. These, especially now with the fentanyl, the dangers are real, the statistics are real, and the fear on our part is real. Now, they, of course, always come back with another way of, well, my friend told me this. And I think that the greatest influence in their lives at this stage are their peers. So we run peer guidance programs. We try to have safe school ambassadors all over school who are on social media, who are trained in low-level interventions, trained to recognize the signs of students who may be decompensating or posting bizarre little pictures or messages on social media that just seem a little out there, and that they know when they can intervene. They also know when it's above their pay grade and they need to get an adult involved. So we've worked with a lot of those kind of organizations. And it's constant. It's like the cheating technology. They find a new way to cheat. We find a new way to catch them. They come up with another way. It's a cat and mouse game. Only right now, it's a really dangerous cat and mouse game, especially with the way that pharmaceuticals have picked up.
Thank you. I think it's important that we provide some tips to our audience. So I'd like to invite each of you to share a couple of tips, takeaways practical that our audience could really use. Nancy, I'm going to start with you. If you could share some tips that you think would be important for our audience.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the signs that students or kids might be engaging in substance use. If there's any kind of change in their mood or their level of functioning, like if they start to withdraw or become more apathetic, maybe you're seeing more acting out, angry outbursts. If they lose interest in things that normally brought them joy, like they stop going to the sporting events or engaging in their hobbies, if they stop attending to their self-care and have poor hygiene, or it seems like their self-esteem is lower. Maybe they're staying in their room, they're withdrawing from family activities or conversations, or they're taking risks and hanging out with a different crowd. So all of those things can be sort of signals, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish, like, what is normal teenage behavior. But if there's a bunch of these different things that are happening, or something just seems a little off, I would recommend definitely checking in with your teen or young adult and just trying to have a conversation and figure out what's going on, because it could be but they've turned to substances to cope. So just looking for those warning signs.
Oh, thank you. Kevin, go ahead.
One of the things that we found, and someone mentioned in one of the Q&As, was how do you teach your kids refusal skills? Our kids are actually super respectful of each other. Respect is huge with teenagers. It's their currency. It's how they get through the day, really, and build their own kind of self identity. But if a kid goes to a party, or if a kid is offered something, says, "No, I'm good. I'm going to be sober tonight. I'm not." 9 times out of 10, people will respect that. It's similar to the LGBT issue, where adults seem to get more wound up about identity issues and trans issues than the kids. The kids are fine. They accept it. They understand. So sober kids can have a social life. Sober kids can say, "No, I'm good. Are you kidding me? I've got a test tomorrow. No, I'm fine. I'm clean right now. I'm on a streak. I'm 45 days," whatever it is. We found that most kids will respect that, will honor that, and we'll stop there. And they go, "Fine, but as long as you're not a narc, as long as you're not going to turn us in," they can still hang and still have a social life. So I don't think that I think kids need to understand that they don't necessarily need to bow to the peer pressure. They can sometimes come across as stronger, more just having more kind of self-respect if they refuse and they just say, "No, I'm good, thanks. Knock yourself out, but I'm good tonight."
Yeah, I always tell my kids to blame me. Like, "Oh, my mom is gonna check me. My mom is gonna do this. I can't get in trouble with her." So I'm like, let me always be your out in social settings. Let me be the uncool mom.
We've done things before where we've put kids on contracts where they'll agree to mandatory testing. Drug testing, and the kids are like, "Oh, I can't believe you're doing that." I go, "This is your out. When anybody ever offers you anything, you say, 'No, are you kidding me? I'm getting tested. I can't do it.'" So and the other kids will go, "Oh yeah, I get it. Because if I do it again, I'll get kicked out." So that's a good strategy too.
I've had parents who actually will drug test their kids with the little strips you can get in the pharmacy. And same thing, it's a way they can monitor, but it's also an out for the kids to say, "My parents drug test me, so I can't do this."
Yeah. Wendy, Amy, any tips you'd like to share?
Well, yeah, one of the most important things parents can do is to spend one-on-one time with their children. It can be really difficult. I know parents have 2 jobs, they're stressed, and there's so much going on. Their children trying to find a time can be difficult. But if you make it a ritual, if you make it, this is who we are as a family. On Wednesday, I'm going to spend time with Tommy. And if there are 2 parents, the other parent can spend time with Sally, but you schedule it and you keep to it. Doesn't have to be long. 15 minutes seems like forever when you get a parent all to yourself. Some kids don't have that. And you can check in with them, see if they have any problems. But I would suggest that it often works much better if you're involved in an activity with them. That's fun. My 13-year-old grandson lives in Arizona, and we talk on the phone. We play Yahtzee or Scrabble or kind of simple games, and then he'll talk to me while we're playing. He talks to me some before, but it's easier, I think, for kids to talk when you're doing an activity with them. They have you there. You're attending to what they like, and you're participating with them, and then you're encouraging some conversation at the same time. And that the value of that scheduling it and the ritual part of it is as important as the activity itself, and sticking to it with your phone someplace else, and all those kinds of things. And we want to talk honestly to our kids. If there's addiction in the family, they may not know, their parents may not be drinking or using, but their grandparent might, or that the uncle, your mom's brother, how he acts really funny, kind of strange and sometimes scary. Well, he drinks a lot of alcohol, and so we want a better life for you. And so here's some fun things that we can do that don't involve drinking or using. And And then, you can, as kids get older, you can't start to explain the brain science, what happens. There are changes in a person's brain, first when they experience trauma or chronic stress, which can set them up for addiction. But after that has happened, then we want to just talk about how brain changes. And I've seen that work with kids. You show them the scans. There's debate about some of those scans, but this is your brain using drugs and this is without it. And often that in itself is like, really, that could happen to me. And so just some information, as Kevin said, parents are educators too, and the child's first educator. So working together with the school to make sure there's that kind of information, and there's refusal skills. Parents can help their kids with that. What if somebody wants you to be mean to another kid, and you don't want to be teasing them? What could you do instead? Or even about feelings. Talking about feelings and making that safe is really crucial. I could have included that in every time I talked, but, see that person on TV, do you think they're feeling sad, or what kind of feeling do you think they would have? And when do you feel sad? And just, making it safe and normal to talk about feelings and not, pretending like they're not there.
Thank you.
And when parents are when kids are having intense emotional reactions, I think it's really important for parents to self-regulate and manage their emotions. It's often called co-regulation,
Yes.
where the parents sort of model appropriate emotional reactions, talking about feelings and not escalating the situation more by screaming at them and kind of matching their intensity.
I've done quite a bit of work with Challenge Success, which is a program that comes out of the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Denise Pope and Margaret Dunlap, and they're pretty well known in the field of adolescent experience. And they've talked about how kids are sending mixed messages to their parents. And parents are thinking that their kids don't want to hang out with them. And the kids are sending all those kind of messages. They're in the room, they're playing their games, they're always going out with friends. But the actual truth is kids really do want to hang out with their family. Their family time is still critical as adolescents. And we see it, especially in high school. Oftentimes the kids will get to high school and the parents are like, okay, good. All the elementary and middle school stuff, now I can leave into high school. It's not true. We need to be with our kids. I have 3 boys in college. They still want to be with us. And we have to be creative to make those experiences happen, to create those opportunities. They're not that sophisticated to be able to say it to you. It's probably not cool to say it to you. But as parents, we need to be able to find ways to hang out with our kids, even if it's, it could be anything, but family time is still critically important to the development of these adolescents.
I think that comes to my tip, and that would be to meet kids where they are. I think one of the things that I would carry with this conversation too about a tip would be the idea that it's always evolving and changing. So if your kids are willing to find a space, maybe you're still driving them to practice to a sport, and after 10 minutes of complaining in the car about how miserable it was, you get about their day. You don't pry for it, you wait for it and listen to them to take the lead. On the other hand, too, another thing about like being savvy and asking when we talk about this being practical is making sure we know what to ask about. So a lot of times we're not going to know what those substances are because they're different than what we had. Or, the idea of using Snapchat to buy drugs wasn't even available when I was a teenager. So the hard part sometimes too is to gather that information as a parent when that information isn't readily available. So you may have to check out what they're watching on television, see if you catch it. I know I caught my 17-year-old watching Euphoria, and it was an eye-opener for many reasons for me. But so making sure we kind of are connected with where our kids, we listen, we let them create the space. We don't ask for the space. And we try and understand the world through their eyes a little bit. That may help us with a lot of the connections we're talking about here too.
I'm pretty tech savvy, I'll say, but I will go to my college student and be like, okay, I know Instagram's out. How do I do better in my other social media platforms? And I have him teach me how to use social media in order for me to get tech savvy. And it's like, when I realized, you could have these private conversations, or you could set your settings on private. I'm like, well, let me see yours. Oh, how come yours are set like that? So it opens up some conversation, but it also clued me into kind of the tips of how I need to kind of stay connected and stay tech savvy with my own children. And it's really surprising because my 9 and 8-year-old are just as savvy. I've set so many blockers on computers in their room, and they have broken through all of them. So I asked them how they're doing it, and they're so honest right now. And I'm not going to get upset because they're telling me the truth, right? Because I want to develop that open, honest communication so that I have that foundation going into if there's tougher times. I think, Amy, you said something that I think is really important that I want to make sure we emphasize, is that it's also about our reaction and how we're managing stress. And also, is there stress we're also putting on our children and our adolescents? And so really thinking about that, because that's an area as a parent we can control. And we can control those, our reactions, but also the pressure that we might be putting on our kids. So I think that's also something to think about as a parent, you know, that are we maybe contributing to some of the stressors or making an environment that's stressful as well?
One of the things we talk about with social media is that given that they all want to go to the very best colleges that they can get into, and they all want these amazing jobs that they see people having, is we explain to them how employers and college admissions officers are very aware of social media, and they don't want necessarily to bring a cloud of suspicion upon their company or upon their college through dubious social media activity of the people they're admitting into their company or their colleges. So we work on them as soon as they get to high school. Keep your social media clean. Don't put anything stupid on there. I mean, one of the things that when we were young, we got up to stuff, but we didn't put it on, we didn't advertise it or put it on social media. Now it seems they want to put everything on social media. So we work with them to make sure that their email names are not ridiculous, that this would be something that they would be happy to put on a resume or onto a college application, and that companies do hire interns, young interns, smart college level students, graduate students, to screen applicants for these companies, and they scour the social media platforms of these students to make sure that they're not bringing anything to the company that the company wouldn't be comfortable with. And that seems to resonate. It seems to resonate with some of the high achieving kids and some of the ambitious kids, and they start developing those habits early on, hopefully.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everyone. We have some time left for questions, so I'm going to go into the Q&A section. And if any one of you want to answer the question, please just jump in and answer it. I'm going to first start as kind of a springboard of Kevin, of what you were talking about, you know, kids going to college. But there's a question: any tips on conversations for college age students who are somewhat estranged from you? So we might not have that solid foundation, or, you know, they're physically removed now because they're in college. Any tips any panelists could provide?
I have a couple of tips. So I think as we think about college kids, it's important to recognize they're not in the home. If you have a level of estrangement, you're not going to have that day-to-day connection. There's two suggestions I might recommend. One of them is a lot of the stuff that's looking at college students is not focusing on abstinence. It's focusing on a harm reduction platform. And so one thought is in the field, there's something called protective behavior strategies. So your child may use, but you can teach them ways to use in a more responsible manner. So if you have that teachable moment or that time with them to maybe say, okay, if you're going to a party and drinking, have food on your stomach, alternate between water and drinks, have a designated driver. You're not going to stop them from drinking. You may not be able to, even if you want, but you may be able to mitigate severe consequences like a DUI, an overdose, a blackout, something like that. So I would say that would be one thing I would definitely recommend that parents consider doing. And the other one is I also teach in the undergraduate program at Stanford, and I see a lot of kids who are pretty helicopter parented by their still. And I think the more we try and kind of keep a radar on where our kids going, the more savvy they could potentially get. So I think that's another thing to be mindful for, is you might want to be reaching out feeling like you need more and more contact with them when in fact that may be backfiring with you. So that might be another thought, is to really think about the level of interaction and engagement you have with your child and whether or not that's promoting their independence that they may be seeking as a college student too.
Could anyone on the panel offer effective approaches to help families, children, or youth with previous use of prescribed psychotropics to distinguish medical use from unhealthy use? So addiction tendencies related.
So if a student or a child is prescribed a medication, sort of the difference between healthy versus unhealthy. I mean, I think that the first thing would be taking the medication as prescribed. So if they're prescribed a certain dose, sticking to that dose, making sure you're working closely with the provider and not taking more than what's prescribed unless you really clear that with the professional. Because I do see a lot of that, particularly I mentioned for ADHD and some other conditions where they might be prescribed a stimulant and then they start taking more because they like the effects of it, or they notice that it helps them study. That starts to get into the realm of more risky use and can develop into a substance use disorder. But not all medications, turn into substance use. It's a medication because it's treating an underlying mental health condition. And if we use it as prescribed, and really careful about that. And then if parents notice that their child is using more, maybe their prescription runs out sooner than it should, and they're asking for refills, that would sort of be a red flag. Okay, they're not using it as prescribed, they're misusing it. And maybe we need to go back to the physician and find a different medication, or talk about, ways they can use it in a safer method.
Thank you.
And sometimes children get afraid to see their parents taking medication as well. And that gives you an opportunity, that kids have heard a lot about opioids, and if their parents had surgery and they're taking it, a younger child might worry about that, to explain just really what Nancy said, except for about the parents' own use and how important it is to just take what, do what the doctor says.
Yeah, as well-versed as I am in this subject, parenting is very difficult. And my youngest has a prescription for ADHD. And when he was younger, we used to say it was his vitamins. Well, one day we found that he had taken a few more because he's like, vitamins are good for me, I should be eating more of these. And it ended up with a trip to the hospital. And so I think there's also a level of being very open and honest about what your child is taking. I was thinking it was too young to say you have a medication because you have ADHD, but in all honesty, that's what I should have done and should have been truthful with him. So I think that's also, sometimes we sugarcoat things for our children and don't think they're ready to handle some of those conversations. But in actuality, that would have been the best course in the best situation. So, parents we're going to make mistakes, and we've got to autocorrect from there. I do want to recognize that Kevin Buchanan, as a high school principal, is a very busy man. And so he did have to jump off in a meeting that he had at his high school. One question that was earlier, but I want to make sure I capture it. Is if parents are using alcohol to have fun, socially, Super Bowl is coming up, there's a lot of drinking and parties. How can we expect children not to do it? In the US, alcohol and getting drunk are kind of synonymous with having fun. So any things that we could think about, is that the challenge? Does it start with parents or something else?
You always want to consider all factors in your child's life, right? And you're a big factor as a parent. So we do know that the relationship you have with alcohol is going to influence the beliefs that your child is going to have about alcohol even before you use. So there is that context. I mean, particularly if you do a lot of partying in the home and your children are there, that's something that you may have to think about. And I think as a parent, to be practical, well, where does that fall? Do you explain to the children that this is what you do, that you understand the limits? Do you explain to them sometimes like, well, mom had a little bit too much last night, and let me tell you how she felt. This is something I think that is very family specific, but the elephant in the room is that your children are watching you. They're watching what you do. They're watching what you don't do. And if alcohol is an important part of your life, then I think you need to think about how you're going to have that relationship. And it can be as simple as like, mom's had a rough day. Oh, I need that glass of wine. And you sit down and have dinner. Well, you might be seeing it as a way to reduce tension, but your child who's 8 or 9 might be seeing it as the way to cope with tension. So we need to just be mindful that that conversation needs to start, because kids develop expectancies long before they ever try that use. So thinking about how you're going to navigate that is one thing, and that's family specific.
Yeah, I would just tag on, modeling self-discipline and self-regulation around alcohol, substances, and cell phone use. Because again, they're watching you and they see you connected to your phone and sort of checked out. And so then they're, likely to do those behaviors.
Any recommendations on how to provide help to parents who are already struggling with their parenting skills, and giving them support on how to help their own children with substance use?
I mean, I would highly recommend therapy, maybe individual therapy for the child or teen, or family therapy. Wendy, you could probably speak more to that, but that can often be very helpful to open up the conversation with someone there who can sort of mediate and lead the conversation, provide a safe place where all voices can be heard, and maybe improve some of the communication and sort of disrupt some of the unhealthy dynamics that might be contributing to the problems.
Yeah, it can be very difficult to have that kind of conversation on our own, without somebody helping us, especially if we're not used to talking to our children that way. If they're adolescents and we're thinking, okay, I really want to relate differently. I really want to give them information differently. It can be met with a lot of resistance or many different reactions that are family specific, as you say. And so getting someone to help mediate those conversations can be really helpful.
I would just pepper in consistency as everything too. That if you have one parent who says one thing and one parent who does another, now you've split the system. So if we were thinking about a younger child and they were coming into therapy, I'd say there's actually a great approach. It's called parent training. We teach you how to be consistent in your practices across your children. It's obviously more challenging with adolescents because we have less influence. But I think the more whoever is a significant person who's doing that parenting in your system is, if they're able to be consistent, that's going to help you with the situations as well.
There's a question that came in. What age can you explain to a child that their parent may have a history with drug use and maybe still using? So at what age would we tell a child that they have a parent who has a history?
So the parent, did you say the parent was still using? Did I hear that at the end? Yeah.
Still be using.
That's kind of a tough one. The child knows. I mean, children know when they're Claudia Black has 3-year-olds draw pictures of what it looks like. So so they know. But I don't know, for some reason the age 8 or 9 comes to mind. They'll notice it before, but I have to really think about what it's like. Claudia Black in the resources has a book called Straight Talk, and that's what it's about. Parents with problems with drugs or alcohol, either in the past or currently, how to talk to your child about drugs and alcohol and about your, so I think that's an excellent reference.
I think another way, though, is to talk about it in terms that kids understand. Like I can vividly remember my now 17-year-old asking me once, "Mommy, why would somebody smoke cigarettes?" And I explained addiction by talking about how he couldn't stop eating gummy bears. And it's, I think putting it in those terms, kind of like, well, it's like gummy bear, like talking about the one food he couldn't stop eating and then talking about it that way. We're not talking about addiction, but we're talking about the seeds of what addiction is, which is a behavior that it's hard to stop because something else is controlling it. And then you can ease into these higher level thoughts about what addiction is as the child comes to an understanding about what drugs are. But that might be one thought, is when there's not too young that you can talk about the fact that no, you shouldn't be eating 6 bags of gummy bears, right? So we can kind of use what the child gives us as a guide.
I think there's an elephant in the room, right? As a parent, I find out that my high schooler, let's just pretend, has tried or is actively using marijuana or alcohol or something else. What is my best approach? Like, what should I do? If you were to coach me through it, What should I do?
Start talking about it with them. Find out what are their motivations for using? Why are they doing it? What is the context of their use? Is it with their friends? Are they doing it alone? Are they, like we talked about, self-medicating, coping with stressors? And, see if you can talk to them about alternative ways to deal with some of these difficult emotions or stressors. I think opening the conversation, finding out what's going on, why they're doing what they're doing would probably be the first step. And also being non-judgmental and not coming across as punitive and shutting them down and making threats. Just really trying to be understanding that this is normative.
And I would just say, to back things up with what you said earlier, Nancy, not overreacting on first, right? It's very easy to get upset and kind of escalate. Stepping back, also thinking about the fact that if it's very different if you have a 12-year-old who's using versus a 17-year-old, making sure you understand where your child is developmentally. And obviously you probably don't want to have that be part of your child's life, but it may be a very different reason at those different ages too. So, and then have that communication about why and understanding the context.
Okay, so let me go a step further. This will be our last question. I know there's a few left in there, but this will be the last one. What about if I know that my child has an addiction already, but is refusing treatment? What can I do?
I think that's a really tough one. And I do hear that a lot. Maybe exploring, like, sort of going in the back door of, like, what are some of the other problems that they're having, maybe trying to address their other mental health, if they're depressed, if they have anxiety, if they're suicidal, any other negative consequences that they're experiencing, kind of going at it at that angle, like what's not working for them in their life, and not like blaming it all on the substance use, especially if they're sort of resistant, finding other ways to approach it that they may be more open to.
I would also just add too that you can't make someone the change that doesn't want to change. And that's kind of at the heart here. But sometimes we get teachable moments in our kids' lives where they're a little bit more vulnerable. And I think the hardest part as a parent is to learn patience, right? That's what I think a lot of folks would say. But that may be what it takes. And we all want our children not to fall and not to hurt and to be successful. But sometimes when a child is not listening and they're having problems, you may have to let them have that failure and then use that failure as a teachable moment. And I know that's not what parents want to hear, but going back to this idea of being practical, that may be the moment, the intervention. And even then you may not get them to change, but you might plant that seed that does get them to change later. So I think one of the things we talk about in addiction is the importance of motivation. There's an intervention called motivational interviewing. And it's a style of work that pretty much says, meet people where they are. And what you're doing is developing intrinsic motivation to get people to change. And that might be a hard thing to have to think about, but that might be the thing that motivates, being patient, listening, peppering in stuff. Kids listen to what you say even when they don't listen. And that might be over time the kinds of things that may make that decisional balance and time change for that teen.
Well, on behalf of Palo Alto University, thank you for joining us. This has been an important conversation, and I want to thank our panelists for your time and expertise. If you'd like additional information, please reach out to our external affairs team at external affairs, one word, at paloaltou.edu. That's again, external affairs at paloaltou.edu. And thank you again for joining us, and have a great day and be well.